Why would a president release 1 million chickens into the wild? When Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso made that announcement, the world was stunned. Even his closest advisors hesitated. International journalists scoffed, calling it absurd. A country struggling with hunger and insecurity, they said, could not afford such an expensive gamble. Critics whispered that the young captain-turned-president had finally gone too far, that his populist gestures were catching up with him. But Traoré stood before Parliament with conviction. "This is not chaos," he declared. "This is strategy." Burkina Faso was in crisis. Swarms of desert locusts and outbreaks of caterpillars were devastating fields of sorghum, millet, and maize. Entire harvests disappeared overnight. Farmers who had worked for months stood helpless as their crops turned to dust in just hours. International aid organizations promised help, but their solutions were slow, bureaucratic, and costly. Imported pesticides from Europe could kill insects, but at the price of poisoning fragile soils and deepening dependency. Traoré wanted another path, one that was African, natural, and sustainable. His answer was chickens. Few notice that chickens are nature's most overlooked army. They devour locusts, caterpillars, beetles, and worms with relentless appetite. One chicken can eat hundreds of insects a day. Multiply that by 1 million and you have a living defense force, one that costs less than chemicals and regenerates itself. But Traoré's gamble went further than pest control. Every chicken released would also lay eggs, reproduce, and provide protein to rural families. He framed it as both defense and survival. Every chicken is a soldier, he told his people, but every chicken is also a provider. On the day of release, villagers gathered in open fields as trucks arrived. Crates opened and a tide of feathers poured into the grasslands. Children laughed, chasing the birds. Farmers watched with quiet hope. International cameras captured the spectacle. A nation unleashing a feathered army against one of nature's oldest scourges. Behind the optics, however, was a political calculation. By choosing chickens over chemicals, Traoré was making a defiant statement. Burkina Faso would fight its battles with its own resources, not with solutions imported at the cost of sovereignty. And so the question emerged. Was this truly a strategy of genius, or the reckless gamble of a desperate leader? The gamble began with a crisis. Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in the Sahel, was under siege, not from soldiers but from insects. Swarms of desert locusts darkened the skies, stripping fields bare. Crop-eating caterpillars devoured what little survived. Sorghum, millet, maize, the staples that fed millions, were wiped out within days. For farmers who had tilled their land for months under a punishing sun, the devastation was almost biblical. Entire villages faced hunger. Families rationed what remained, and children went to bed with empty stomachs. International aid organizations promised help, but help came slowly, tied up in paperwork and foreign contracts. The solution, aid officials said, was pesticides. Chemicals shipped from Europe at enormous cost. But pesticides would drain the country's already strained budget, damage fragile soils, and leave farmers dependent on foreign imports. President Ibrahim Traoré, only in his 30s and already a symbol of defiance, rejected that path. To him, chemicals were not strategy, they were submission. He wanted something African, something that worked with nature instead of against it. His answer was chickens. At first, the idea sounded ridiculous. Chickens, after all, were poor people's livestock, not a tool of statecraft. Yet Traoré saw what others ignored. Chickens are voracious insect hunters. A single bird can eat hundreds of locusts, caterpillars, and beetles each day. Multiply that by 1 million, scattered across fields and villages, and suddenly Burkina Faso had a natural army. Cheap, mobile, and self-replicating. But Traoré's vision stretched beyond pest control. He framed every chicken as a double asset, a soldier and a provider. Once the insect swarm subsided, those same birds would lay eggs, breed, and feed rural families. Protein intake would rise. Malnutrition among children could decline. Food security would no longer depend on imported wheat or powdered milk. The cost was immense. Procuring, breeding, and distributing 1 million birds tested the limits of the national budget. Teams of logisticians mapped provinces, ensuring birds were released widely enough to cover the country. Trucks carried crates across dusty roads to villages that had never seen government attention before. It was a nationwide operation disguised as chaos. When the release day arrived, it looked almost theatrical. Crates opened and chickens spilled into the fields by the thousands. Children squealed with laughter. Elders shook their heads in disbelief. Farmers, cautious but desperate, watched silently. International media cameras rolled, seizing on the strangeness of the moment. A poor African nation fighting famine with feathers. Critics abroad sneered. Western commentators mocked Burkina Faso as wasting millions on poultry theatrics. Newspapers printed headlines like, "A country goes to the birds." But Traoré countered with a simple line. What is costly is hunger. What is costly is dependence. Chickens are an investment, not an expense. And slowly the results began to appear. Farmers in test zones reported that the swarms seemed thinner, their crops less ravaged. Locust clouds that once covered the skies broke apart as birds devoured their advancing fronts. Fields that should have been stripped bare showed signs of survival. Meanwhile, markets began to shift. Eggs appeared in greater numbers, selling at prices families could afford. Mothers spoke on local radio of children eating protein regularly for the first time in years. Poultry trade in villages grew brisk as families who had received chickens began to breed and sell them. Instead of buying chemicals, communities invested in feed and simple veterinary care, stimulating small-scale local economies. Traoré had turned ridicule into curiosity. By choosing chickens, he wasn't just fighting locusts, he was reframing Burkina Faso's identity. This was not aid, it was innovation. Not dependency, but sovereignty. International observers were forced to reconsider. What had started as an apparent stunt was showing measurable gains. Crop losses down, eggs up, rural incomes rising. Delegations from neighboring Mali and Niger quietly visited to study the outcomes. Regional radio carried stories of the feathered army. And yet the gamble remained fragile. Disease outbreaks could sweep through poultry populations. Logistics could fail. The ecosystem could shift in unexpected ways. The risks were real. But Traoré bet on something larger than biology. He bet on perception. By unleashing chickens, he unleashed a narrative. A story that Burkina Faso, mocked as poor and weak, could innovate in its own way. A story that dignity could be reclaimed not with debt or dependency, but with courage. And as the first weeks passed, a new question began to circulate. Not just among farmers or critics, but in diplomatic halls abroad. What if this gamble actually worked? The release of 1 million chickens was supposed to be a spectacle. What it became was a turning point. In the weeks after the birds scattered into fields and villages, signs of change emerged. Locust swarms that once rolled like storm clouds across the Sahel began to thin. Farmers who had expected ruin found their crops scarred but not destroyed. Sorghum stalks still stood. Maize cobs ripened. For the first time in years, the cycle of devastation slowed. Word spread quickly. In villages where chickens roamed freely, children collected eggs each morning. Families who once survived on one meal a day now had protein on their plates. The laughter that had greeted the release turned into cautious pride. "These chickens," one farmer told a radio interviewer, "are working harder than the chemicals ever did." The optics were impossible to ignore. International reporters who had mocked the policy were forced to return, cameras in hand, to capture the results. Images of fields dotted with chickens devouring insects began appearing in Western media. What had been dismissed as absurd now carried the weight of possibility. But the true climax was political. Traoré understood that in politics, symbols matter as much as statistics. And the image of a nation fighting hunger with chickens was too powerful to dismiss. He leaned into the mockery, smiling in interviews when foreign journalists asked if he really believed chickens could save a country. "Yes," he said, "sometimes the foolish win." That phrase, repeated across headlines, flipped the narrative. What began as ridicule became intrigue. Think tanks in Europe and North America started publishing reports on avian biocontrol strategies. Agricultural universities dispatched students to study the outcomes. Western critics, once confident in their derision, suddenly found themselves on the defensive. Inside Burkina Faso, the reactions were even more dramatic. The opposition tried to frame the plan as wasteful, a distraction from serious governance. Yet each time they spoke, they were drowned out by testimonies from farmers whose fields had survived, or mothers whose children were now eating eggs daily. Local councils reported that poultry markets were booming, creating new streams of income. The chickens, in short, had become politically untouchable. Traoré seized the momentum. He mandated that at least 30% of chickens be distributed to women-led households, a move that both empowered rural women and secured his government political capital among groups often neglected. He also insisted that local councils, not central ministries, oversee distribution, giving villages ownership of the project and blunting accusations of favoritism. The gamble was no longer just about pest control. It was transforming into a new social contract. Farmers who once felt abandoned began to see themselves as partners in national survival. Village elders told local radio stations, "No one has ever fought locusts with chickens. But if they are our chickens, then it is our fight." Across borders, neighboring states took notice. Niger and Mali sent quiet delegations to observe. What they found was striking. In test zones where chickens roamed, pest damage had fallen by nearly 40% compared to control areas. Without a leader of imported pesticide, Burkina Faso had achieved measurable impact. And the spectacle rippled further. Youth across Africa posted memes of chickens in helmets, captioned "Africa Fights Back." Musicians wrote songs about the feathered army. A strategy that had begun as desperation was becoming folklore. Yet behind the celebration lay sharp calculation. Traoré was not only feeding people, he was reshaping how Burkina Faso was perceived. At the African Union, he declared, "A nation that can defend its crops with chickens can defend itself against poverty with courage." Delegates applauded, not because they all believed in chickens, but because they recognized the defiance in the statement. The West had offered chemicals. Aid agencies had offered dependency. Traoré had offered something else, a symbol of sovereignty. Still, the risks loomed large. Disease outbreaks in poultry could wipe out gains. Logistics might fail. Critics warned of ecological imbalance. Yet the narrative was now bigger than the risks. Chickens were no longer just birds. They were metaphors for independence. And as the world watched, the question grew louder. Had Burkina Faso turned ridicule into revolution? The true weight of Traoré's gamble was not measured in feathers or wings. It was measured in daily life. And in Burkina Faso, daily life was changing. In the countryside, the presence of chickens transformed routines. Families who once rose only to tend struggling crops now began their mornings collecting eggs. Women carried baskets to roadside stalls, selling surplus eggs for the first time. Local diets shifted. Protein intake increased, especially among children. Teachers in rural schools noticed students more alert, less fatigued. What had started as pest control was quietly becoming a nutrition program. The economic ripple was immediate. Villages that had relied on expensive pesticides began pooling resources into co-ops for poultry feed and simple veterinary care. Markets that once sold imported grains now bustled with chickens and eggs. Poultry farmers emerged where none had existed, trading birds, building pens, and reinvesting profits. A sense of commerce revived in rural areas long ignored by central governments. Politically, Traoré had struck gold. By ensuring that distribution was managed by local councils rather than distant ministries, he gave communities ownership of the project. Villages that had long felt forgotten by the capital now saw the state present in a tangible way. People said, "The president remembered us." For many, it was the first time they felt directly included in a national initiative. Traoré's mandate that 30% of the chickens go to women-led households further deepened the impact. Women, often the backbone of rural families but rarely acknowledged in policy, now had resources in their hands. Eggs became both food and income. Roadside stalls run by women multiplied, and with them political loyalty to the young president. Critics called it populism. Supporters called it justice. The opposition struggled. They warned that the costs were unsustainable, that chickens could not replace systemic governance. But every time they raised alarms, they were met with testimonies from farmers whose fields had been saved, or mothers who could now afford medicine with egg money. Opposition leaders found themselves boxed into an impossible corner. How do you criticize something that is visibly working? Meanwhile, Traoré leveraged the program to push broader reforms. Subsidies were introduced for poultry feed made from local grains, creating a feedback loop. Crop farmers supplied feed to poultry farmers, and poultry farmers, in turn, protected crops from pests. Veterinary training centers expanded, professionalizing animal care in rural areas. Small veterinary posts popped up across provinces, staffed by newly trained technicians, giving communities services they had never had before. Beyond the numbers, there was psychology. Burkina Faso, often portrayed as poor and dependent, began to see itself differently. Murals appeared in Ouagadougou depicting chickens chasing away locusts. Musicians released songs praising the feathered soldiers. Village elders told stories to children about how the nation turned birds into protectors. The narrative was no longer only about pest control, it was about dignity. Traoré's gamble reshaped the very language of politics. No longer did leaders speak only of aid or loans. They spoke of resilience, sovereignty, and African solutions. Farmers began to describe their harvest not as charity from abroad, but as victories won by their own ingenuity. But it was not without challenges. Outbreaks of poultry disease occasionally swept through villages, forcing emergency veterinary campaigns. Critics pointed to these moments as proof the experiment could collapse. Yet each challenge was met with adaptation, improved vaccines, new training, better monitoring. Instead of undermining the program, the setbacks built new institutions. The civil impact reached schools as well. The government began channeling surplus eggs into school feeding programs. Malnutrition rates among children fell. Attendance improved. Parents, once skeptical, now praised the program, not just as a fight against locusts, but as an investment in the next generation. Politically, Traoré consolidated his standing. The chickens became more than policy, they became untouchable. Opposition leaders realized that attacking the program meant attacking farmers, women, and children whose lives had visibly improved. The gamble had become a shield, protecting the president from political threats. And the ripple did not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. Delegations from Mali, Niger, Chad, and Kenya arrived to study the program firsthand. They walked fields with farmers, counted eggs in markets, and listened to testimonies from villagers. What they saw was difficult to dismiss. Pest damage reduced, incomes up, optimism revived. Burkina Faso was no longer just another struggling state in the Sahel. It was becoming a reference point, a model of African ingenuity. For the first time in decades, the nation had shifted the narrative from fragility to innovation. Yet with every success, the stakes rose higher. Traoré had built a powerful story, but stories can falter if results fade. The nation now faced a question. Could it sustain this fragile ecosystem of hope, or would the gamble collapse under the weight of expectation? While Burkina Faso's villages adjusted to a new rhythm of eggs and feathers, the outside world was forced to pay attention. In Europe, think tanks that had once mocked the program began releasing cautious reports. Unconventional but promising, one analyst wrote, noting that Burkina Faso had saved tens of millions in grain losses without importing a single liter of pesticide. Aid agencies that had pushed chemical solutions now found themselves embarrassed, scrambling to reframe the initiative as community-driven ecological innovation. In Washington, the reaction was quieter but no less significant. For decades, the U.S. had invested heavily in pesticide campaigns across Africa, often through USAID programs. Traoré's defiance raised uncomfortable questions. If chickens could succeed where chemicals failed, what did that say about billions spent on conventional aid? Some American analysts began to argue that the lesson was not about poultry, but about sovereignty. It's not the chickens that matter, one U.S. think tank noted. It's the fact that Africans are designing solutions without waiting for us. The strategic implications were clear. By rejecting dependency, Burkina Faso was aligning itself with a multipolar world, working with China on poultry feed plants, with Brazil on genetics, with India on vaccines. The United States risked losing influence if it dismissed such innovations as eccentric. At the African Union, Traoré framed the program as more than national policy. It was a continental model. The West brings chemicals, China brings machines, but Africa brings life, he declared. The applause was not just for chickens, but for defiance. For many African leaders weary of aid dependency, the line resonated deeply. Globally, the narrative began to shift. What had once been a story of ridicule was now appearing in academic journals, in policy debates, even in climate forums. With food insecurity rising worldwide, the question was no longer whether Burkina Faso's gamble was foolish, but whether it was a template. For the U.S., the stakes were uncomfortable. Support the program, and Washington would be admitting that local, low-cost solutions might outshine its own aid strategies. Oppose it and risk appearing hostile to African self-reliance. And so, as the chickens spread across fields, they carried more than feathers. They carried a message that even the smallest nations could disrupt the world order with ideas born not in Washington, not in Brussels, but in Ouagadougou. The world was watching, and the question lingered. If chickens could shift the balance of sovereignty, what might come next? Years after the first crates opened and chickens scattered into Burkina Faso's fields, the gamble that once drew laughter had become something else entirely. A legacy. Crops once doomed to vanish in hours now survived the season. Egg markets grew and malnutrition among children declined. Rural incomes edged upward, powered not by foreign aid but by feathers. The symbolism reached far beyond food security. The chickens became ambassadors of sovereignty, proof that a small nation could reject dependency and still survive. In speeches across Africa, Ibrahim Traoré repeated a simple refrain: "We turned pests into food, crisis into opportunity." It was more than a slogan, it was a redefinition of dignity. But every gamble carries risk. Poultry diseases occasionally flared, demanding swift veterinary campaigns. Ecologists warned of imbalance if chickens spread unchecked. And politically, the gamble tied Traoré's image so tightly to the program that failure could unravel his standing. Success built pride. Failure could breed disillusion. Yet even critics admitted one fact: the narrative had changed. Burkina Faso, long seen as fragile, was now studied as a laboratory of innovation. Delegations from Niger, Mali, Chad, and even Kenya visited not to offer aid but to learn. Scholars compared the strategy to historic pest management systems. Development agencies, once dismissive, quietly borrowed its language. The foresight was clear. If sustained, this feathered revolution could expand into a Sahel-wide ecological defense network, cheap, scalable, and locally owned. Within 3 to 6 months, regional adoption could begin, spreading chickens across borders not only as pest control, but as a symbol of African solidarity. For the United States and the wider world, the implications were sobering. If one of the poorest nations on Earth could innovate its way to resilience, what excuse did wealthier powers have for clinging to failing systems? The question was not about chickens alone. It was about imagination, sovereignty, and the courage to gamble when survival is at stake. So perhaps the real lesson is this: in a century where climate change and food insecurity will define the future, solutions may not come from boardrooms in Washington or Brussels. They may come from a village in Burkina Faso, from a million chickens pecking at the soil, turning ridicule into resilience. And that leaves us with a question. Was Ibrahim Traoré simply lucky, or did he reveal a deeper truth? That sometimes the boldest answers are also the simplest.